You know, God may not operate on our timetable, but He's never late. And He is able to do more than we think if we put Him and His Word first.
Thanks for joining us on Mission 66, your connection to the Bible teaching of TWR in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao. Today, we're in the book of Ruth, which offers timeless lessons in how ordinary people, through faith and obedience, can play a part in God's greater purpose. Download the free study guide at mission66.org. As we begin, ask God to open your heart to His Word. Now here's Esther to get us started.
Welcome to our daily program of Journeying in the Bible. And lately, we've been in the series on the book of Ruth, found in the Old Testament. And now we see the courtship of Ruth and Boaz arriving at its end. And our teacher, John Matthews, will lead us through Ruth chapter 4 with the theme, He is Able.
Esther, thank you so much. Great to be with you again for this latest episode of Mission 66. Really warm welcome as we reach the final chapter of the book of Ruth. What a story it is. You have Ruth, who's from actually the country of Moab, which was an historic enemy of Israel. And she had married one of the sons of Naomi, who was an Israelite, who'd come to Moab with her family to try and get away from a famine that was ongoing back home. But when Ruth's husband, Mahlon, and her father-in-law, Elimelech, died, Ruth committed to follow Naomi, care for her, and accept her God as her own. And so God graciously guides the two of them to a field. And the person who owns the field is a man called Boaz, who initially allows Ruth to follow the reapers of the harvest and gather what those reapers hadn't gathered. And it turns out that this man who owns the field, Boaz, is a distant relative of Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi. And that means he was qualified to be what was known as a kinsman-redeemer. And that was a relative who was able to help one of their family who'd fallen into trouble, as was the case here. In the last episode, we saw how Naomi suggests to Ruth that she make it known that she wants Boaz to marry her, which would clearly mean security for the future and indeed the possibility of keeping the family name alive. And Boaz tells Ruth he's willing to do this, but Boaz is a man of honor, and he knows that there's somebody else, another kinsman, who's actually closer or more closely related to Naomi than he, Boaz, is. And so, according to the custom, that other kinsman first had to be given the chance to redeem Naomi and marry Ruth, if he wanted to. And so there's this uncertainty that's been thrown into the story at the end of the last chapter. And here we are approaching Ruth chapter 4, and we're going to see Boaz arrange a meeting with this other kinsman. And what will happen? Well, let's read on. The suspense is building. This is verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate, and he sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said to him, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down next to Boaz. And he did Boaz, 10 men of the elders of the city, and he said to them, "Sit down here." So they sat down as well. And then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he says, "I will redeem it." Uh-oh. So hang on a minute. It looks like Boaz, by doing the right thing, won't end up with Ruth. Verse 5. Then Boaz says, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And then the Redeemer replied, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And so it turns out that this other kinsman was going to lose his inheritance if he married a foreign woman. So all of a sudden, it's off the table for him. Verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Well, what nice things, isn't it, Esther, to say to Boaz, who was a bachelor? They're asking God to build up his family dynasty like that of Jacob. And interesting as well that they mention here the house of Perez, who in the lineage of Judah was an illegitimate son of Judah's daughter-in-law Tamar. Now the line of Perez was, despite that, to become really important in the Bible, because he was not only a forefather of Boaz himself, but was later to be a forebearer of the future King David. Anyway, let's crack on with the account here in verse 13. So it says, "Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And then the woman said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him.' Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap, and she became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, 'A son has been born to Naomi.' And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And look, if we follow the line of King David, we're going to see that he was a forefather of Mary, the very woman who bore Jesus the Messiah. I wonder whether you caught that. Ruth, the Moabite, who committed herself and her life to her mother-in-law, not knowing what on earth was to follow, returning to a land with nothing, grief-stricken. That decision, well, how significant was that? How significant is God's guidance right here? Because that very Ruth is part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Isn't that brilliant? And it shows that whoever attaches themselves to Israel's God, they are blessed by him and included in that incredible plan of salvation.
Well, our God certainly works in incredible ways, and what a great read. You're listening to Mission 66, and my name is Esther. We're here with our teacher, John Matthews, and I imagine that some questions have come up as a result of what we read in Ruth chapter 4. Now, John, a practice that we've actually read about a few times in previous episodes arises once again here, and that is the pulling off of one's sandal. Where exactly did this practice come from?
Yeah, that's the cultural practice that we saw in verse 7. It's fascinating, this, isn't it? And it's a good question because in ancient Israel, removing or taking off one's sandal was known as a way of sealing the deal when the nearest kinsman refused to redeem their dead relative's property or marry the widow. And I think it evolved or came from Deuteronomy chapter 25, where it was written that this is what should be done in the event that a woman became a widow. In fact, let's just turn to that and read, because it's a good point. So this is verse 5, and this is what it says. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, look, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. So, look, that's sort of what happens here in the book of Ruth chapter 4. It's more symbolic by this time, and perhaps there's clearly less emotion involved. There's no spitting that goes on here, thankfully. But when the near kinsman refuses to buy the land of Elimelech and inherits Ruth, the Moabitess, he is still in this significant way to pull off his sandal as if to say, yes, I won't do it. I refuse. So Boaz, you may be the Redeemer because you are next in line.
And you know, John, just as a result of what he did there, it kind of warms my heart to see how Naomi now becomes this grandmother and she finds this great joy in the birth of Ruth and Boaz's child. It's wonderful to read.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Esther, isn't it? And just that lovely image of this woman who's been through so much and has wept such bitter tears because she's lost her husband and her two sons, but yet here she is, and the text says she takes the child into her arms on her lap. What a lovely image. And That's a reflection of God's goodness through the pain and through the suffering, the other end. And, Naomi, symbolically at least, adopts him, treating him as if he were her own son, and that very baby, surrounded with that comfort and that love and that security, that very baby was going to grow up to be the grandfather of Israel's greatest king. And that, of course, was to be King David.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we still have some great stories to uncover as we proceed in the Bible. But of course, we know that the book of Ruth ends with that short genealogy that you spoke about. And it kind of shows us how things went as it moved forward.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it? And I love that about the Bible, that here we are, but it's pointing. Where's it pointing? It's pointing to Jesus Christ. And this genealogy, it reveals the bigger picture, the greater purpose of this story. And that is how God turns tragedy into a beautiful love story. And it becomes then a story of national significance, really, because Ruth, the Moabite widow, is to become the great-grandmother of King David, whom the Bible calls, and I love this, a man after God's own heart. Would that we would be people after God's own heart. What would the world around us look like if we could be drawn by the Holy Spirit into an intimacy with the Bible and with Jesus? That meant we were more and more people after God's own heart. The world around us would change pretty quickly, I reckon. David's line here into the future led to the ultimate blessing, of course, for all humanity, the coming of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of the world. So, not only do Boaz and Ruth find each other, but their family is to be so significant and blessed by God, because through their very lineage, the hope of salvation for the entire world is realized. Well, that is some ending, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I had something pop into my mind, and so I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, just to ask about why you think Boaz arranged this meeting of the elders at the gate, at the city gate. I mean, wasn't there perhaps a much better location, a more pleasant location? Why specifically at the city gate?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It could have been, couldn't it? Oh, look, come into the front room. We've got some comfy seating in here, but there they are. These cities of Israel's, they were... Well, the city gate was prominent. It was where actually the authorities normally gathered. And so by matter of custom, Boaz knew that he could find this relative at the town gate, because that was the only way that people were able to get in and out of the city. And it was where business deals were transacted. It was where merchants would set up their stands to sell their wares. It was where judgments were rendered. But it was also a major point of defense in case of attack as well. Psalm 127 has this verse, "Blessed is the man who has many sons, who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." So in ancient times, for example, in Greece, they'd meet at the agora, which was a kind of marketplace where many transactions took place. And, the Greeks, they loved to gather at the agora to discuss some new philosophical idea. And similarly here, the town gate was a significant place of meeting where serious things were decided and took place.
Doesn't that remind you of Psalm 24, where it says, "Lift up your heads, O gates"? I imagine that perhaps this concept comes from there, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly right, Esther. The idea and the importance of the city gates are tied to their roles as places of security, of protection, of governance, of decision-making. They are significant points in the life and the daily existence of people within these cities. And remember, in Genesis 19, we also see Lot described as sitting at the city gate, which means he held a significant position in the city, not just as a gatekeeper. So it was a place of decision-making.
So that then leads into why there had to be 10 male leaders in the city. Because, Boaz went and gathered these 10 leaders. Did he have to gather a specific number of men in order to transact this business that he had going on?
Yeah, it's a good spot. Interesting point as well. We don't have actually a definitive answer here within the book of Ruth, but if we look a little more broadly, in Judaism, the number 10 itself is significant or became significant. And it is likely that very tradition began here with this account. For instance, when the temple was later destroyed by the Babylonians and the people were exiled, Judaism as a formal religion began to take shape, and so synagogues were established. But a synagogue could only exist if there were 10 heads of families, 10 recognized male leaders in the community. So this tradition may well have had its roots in this text. There's no earlier record of such a practice as this than here in Ruth chapter 4. So this passage marks the beginning of a tradition that actually was to become pretty important in the history of Judaism.
Interesting. That's great. All right, well, this marriage now between Boaz and Ruth, it seems to me like Boaz had to marry Ruth, but also buy her family's property. And from that, I suppose we can conclude that he wasn't only just redeeming Ruth, but the entire estate that used to belong to Elimelech.
Yeah, that's spot on, Esther. The law of the kinsman-redeemer followed what was written in the law of Moses, in which there was this system in place to protect families from losing their land if the very worst, as in this case, occurred. And the system ensured that life's misfortunes weren't going to result in ongoing, continuous, endless misery and destitution. So Boaz brings forward this new information which we didn't know, but it's included here. And apparently Elimelech, who was Naomi's late husband, still had some property in the area that was now up for sale. And so according to law, if the relative bought the property, he also had to marry the widow, probably because Ruth's former husband, Mahlon, had inherited that property.
Now, that other kinsman, John, we know that he refused. He said that he didn't want to endanger his own inheritance, right? And I imagine that there was a specific reason why he said that. Maybe you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think actually there might be several reasons for this, because either he didn't want to marry a foreigner and didn't know that was going to be a part of the bargain, or he might have learned that if he married Ruth and they had a son together, some of his estate would then transfer away from his family to the family of Elimelech. But whatever his reason, the way was made clear now for Boaz to marry Ruth. And you know what? I think Boaz knew that this other kinsman just kind of knew that he wouldn't agree to the deal. And the story of Ruth is striking because, let's be honest, she faced so much grief and misfortune in her life in Moab. First, her father-in-law dies, then her husband and brother-in-law pass away. And one might well say at that stage, where on earth is God in all this tragedy and suffering? But the passage, the text is spectacular and it's beautiful because it shows us that God transforms the most horrendous tragedy into blessing. Well, listen, if you're going through a time of trial or testing right now, I'd say hang around and stick around, because what is now is not what will be if we trust God. And you never, ever know what God is going to do a matter of time from now.
Well, as we begin to wrap up this beautiful book of Ruth, we see this beautiful scene in verses 11 and 12 where we have the townspeople blessing this new couple and hoping God would make them like Jacob and Rachel and Leah, as well as Perez, who was born of Tamar. But the one thing that can be said about their stories in Genesis is that their lives, it wasn't simple. They in fact had quite a lot of hardship, and we saw some sinful activity taking place in their stories as well.
Yeah, and in that way, Esther, their stories are a little different from the stories of our own families here and now. And you're right. Let's take the example of Jacob. His story is complex, isn't it? You remember, if you remember the story, his uncle Laban cheats him right and left. He switched wives on him even. He gives him Leah first instead of what was promised, which was Rachel. And he then was changing the pay scale on him throughout the time that Jacob was working for him. Rachel, who was loved, couldn't bear the children, whilst Leah, who wasn't loved by Jacob as much as Rachel, had no trouble conceiving. And let's not forget about Jacob himself. Perhaps encouragingly, his record wasn't spotless either. The text mentions something that perhaps we'd rather not dwell on when it says, "May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Now, Judah, he made a serious mistake within his own family. He neglected his duty to provide Tamar with her rightful inheritance, and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, disguised herself as a prostitute, and Judah then ends up being the father of Perez. Now, we don't know if these witnesses were blessing Boaz by this, or whether they were giving him an oblique rebuke for marrying outside of Israel, as if to say, even though you're marrying a foreigner, well, may God still bless you as he blessed Perez, who was the offspring of an incestual affair. And, whatever the intention of the comment, yet look how God uses the imperfections of these people to build a story of redemption out of all of it. And in fact, there would be no story of redemption if God wasn't willing to use imperfection. There would be no salvation for you and I listening to Mission 66 if God wasn't willing to dive in with the saving grace of his son, Jesus Christ, into the mess that is our life sometimes, that is our ancestral story, all of the unsaid things that have happened. God knows them. He knows them. And yet he still meets us at our point of need. And you see how he uses the imperfections of these people in this story to build a story of redemption. And his blessing would continue in the lives of Ruth and Boaz for sure. But we can also be sure that they trusted God.
Absolutely. Oh, and this story really does have an ending where we see that God is able. He is able. And that's the resounding truth of the story. Well, John, I think after all of that great discussion and insight and reflection, how should we summarize this chapter?
Yeah, let's do that as we reach the end of the book of Ruth, as Ruth and Boaz marry and they have a son, and this son brings joy to Naomi, who had experienced so much sorrow in her life, and the child likewise would eventually bring incredible joy, unspeakable to humanity, because he was going to be a direct ancestor of King David and later the line of Jesus himself, the Messiah. There are other implications, massive ones from the story of Ruth, though. For one thing, it exalts the value of family sticking together through thick and thin. For another thing, God rewards diligence and hard work. He sees that. And then we learn that human sexuality is not a plaything, and that marriage is a really serious commitment, and sex is God's gift for that specific union of marriage alone. And Ruth and Boaz, they keep it pure, don't they? They keep it in the way that God intended. And Boaz never does anything with Ruth until after they're married. And that's something in our freewheeling society today that may even be described as old hat, but it's far from that. It is pure. It is the way that God intends things to be, and things work when things are done as God intended. And another thing I think Ruth teaches us is that God may not operate on our timetable, but he's never late. And you said it there, Esther. He is able to do more than we think if we put him where he deserves to be, the place where he is meant to be, the place where life makes sense, the place where we know that we are at home. And that's with him on the throne of our hearts, and his word, the Bible, the subject of Mission 66, as our light and our guide in this life.
Well, thanks, John. And thank you so much, friends, for joining us through this entire journey through the book of Ruth. Next time, we invite you to join us, same place, as we start another series in our journey through the whole Bible, one chapter at a time. Well, I'm Esther for John Matthews and our team saying, see you next time on Mission 66.
As we close today's program, take a minute to download your free study guide. You'll be able to follow along every single day. Plus, you can engage with the reflection and application questions so you can apply the teaching to your life. It's a great companion resource to the audio Bible teaching of John Matthews and Esther Sisulu. To get your free study guide, visit mission66.org. That's mission66.org. You can also support the ministry of Mission 66 when you visit the site. Your gift makes it possible for this great teaching to be heard in many languages around the world. Mission 66 is a ministry of Trans World Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.